No one understood when the announcement was made because there was no visible logic to support that union, and that was exactly why everyone wanted to look more closely, as if observing were an acquired right. He was known for turning everything into numbers, contracts, and silent victories, a man who never made mistakes in public. She entered beside him without asking permission from the space, dressed in firm simplicity, her large body occupying what they had always tried to deny. And in that instant, the entire room held its breath, not out of respect, but out of poorly disguised curiosity. Eyes did not look away. Some lingered too long, others pretended naturalness while silently calculating what that choice meant. It wasn't love they were trying to understand. It was the mistake. The question hung in the air, heavy and indecent, and no one needed to say it out loud for everyone to know exactly what it was. The discomfort did not come from the couple. It came from the frustrated expectation that she would shrink, lower her head, or apologize for existing there. She didn't. She walked slowly, greeted those who extended a hand, sat upright like someone who knew exactly where she was and why. He maintained the cold posture everyone recognized, calculated distance, restrained gestures, as if reinforcing the convenient narrative that this was merely an arrangement, a strategic move, nothing more than that. And perhaps that was exactly what made everyone so comfortable, staring too much, commenting too much, imagining too much. Because when people believe there is no feeling involved, everything seems permitted. Jokes emerged in corners, whispers took shape, and in that specific moment, while muffled laughter tried to hide behind glasses and polite greetings, it becomes impossible not to ask you, watching this scene now, whether you've ever noticed how cruelty often disguises itself as socially acceptable curiosity when it believes no one will be hurt. She noticed, not just that day, but from the very first prolonged look, from the first silence that lasted longer than it should have. And when she noticed, she did something no one expected. She didn't react. She didn't confront. She didn't explain. She simply remained, present, whole, like someone who decides not to offer the world the spectacle it so desperately wants. Meanwhile, among the guests, one man watched with an attention that did not seek scandal. Wealthy, discreet, coming from outside that circle, he wasn't looking at the couple themselves, but at the faces around them, at the expressions that surfaced when people believed they were not being seen. And in that moment, before any bet was revealed, before any contract came to light, the game had already begun, and almost no one realized that it wasn't she who was being tested. The events that followed made it clear that the marriage would not be easily forgotten, because every time she entered a space, something silent rearranged itself around her, as if her presence demanded a moral adjustment no one wanted to make. At dinners, meetings, and social celebrations, the looks grew longer again, now less curious and more irritated, because the expectation of shame was never fulfilled. She didn't try to please, didn't try to compensate, didn't perform gratitude for being there, and that broke an invisible rule many considered natural. The comments became more sophisticated, almost elegant, phrases with trained smiles that hid old judgments. Questions about health, about habits, about the practical side of that marriage appeared as if they were genuine concern, but carried the same intention as always. To reduce, to frame, to make acceptable the idea that that body did not belong in that space. And still, she answered little, sometimes only with a nod, other times with absolute silence, a silence that forced those speaking to hear their own cruelty echo back. He observed everything closely, still maintaining the coldness that had earned him respect, but something was beginning to slip beyond his control. The narrative that he alone owned the game weakened with every situation in which she didn't react as expected. With every moment, the discomfort remained suspended in the air without exploding. There was no drama, no scandal, just a continuous tension that made it impossible to ignore what was being revealed about every person present. At this point, Perhaps you felt the discomfort too, because it's impossible to watch these moments without asking whether the problem was really that marriage or the collective need to see it fail. That is the question that arises now, not as a gratuitous provocation, but as the direct consequence of every look that sought humiliation and found dignity instead. When someone refuses to occupy the role imposed on them, the ones exposed are those who wrote the script. Behind the scenes, parallel bets began to emerge, no longer about money, but about limits, about how much she would endure, about when she would finally give in to the symbolic weight everyone was trying to place on her shoulders. The wealthy Mexican man continued to observe, recording reactions not with haste, but with almost clinical precision, interested not in the couple, but in the moral map forming around them. And then came the moment when it became clear that the embarrassment was no longer in her. It had spread through the room, clinging to faltering laughter, interrupted conversations, and invitations that began to disappear. Before any revelation was made, before the bet officially reached its end, something had already been lost there. And the question that now hangs in the air is simple and uncomfortable. When the game fully turns, who will be prepared to be seen for who they really are? The end of the bet did not happen on a stage, nor did it come with a solemn announcement, because the true revelation was already too mature to require spectacle. Gathered once more, those who had watched, commented and calculated in silence, waited for something intimate, some physical detail that would justify months of speculation, as if her dignity depended on a final scene of embarrassment. What they received was something else, something none of them had prepared to face. The wealthy Mexican man stood calmly and spoke without raising his voice, not to accuse, but to expose. He said the bet was never about the marriage itself, nor about her body, but about who, faced with that union, would reveal a desire to humiliate, who would reduce people to fetish, who would confuse power with the right to invade. As he spoke, contracts were quietly withdrawn, partnerships dissolved, invitations cancelled. There were no shouts, only the dry sound of real consequences materializing. The millionaire everyone believed controlled everything realized then that the game had slipped from his hands from the very beginning. He had accepted the bet believing he controlled the narrative, but it was she who dismantled the board simply by existing without apologizing. She remained seated, listening with no triumph on her face, because revenge was never what she sought. Autonomy was. And in that moment, when eyes finally looked away, not out of contempt but out of shame, it becomes impossible not to feel the weight of what was exposed. Perhaps this is where you, witness to this ending, need to face the question born from that heavy silence. Which side would you have been on when no one was watching? Because it wasn't money that fell, nor an isolated reputation. It was the comfortable illusion that judging bodies and lives would carry no cost. That is the counterintuitive shock imposed now, realizing that humiliation was never where everyone pointed, but in those who needed it to feel above. She was the last to stand, crossed the room with the same calm presence as on the first day, and left without a speech, leaving behind a group morally naked, stripped of the masks they believed were solid. And if this story unsettled you, if something inside shifted when you realized how a gaze can wound more than words, perhaps it's because not every injustice needs to be committed to be shared. Sometimes it's enough to watch in silence. If you believe stories like this need to be told so that discomfort is not forgotten, follow this channel, because not every social test ends when the bet is over. Subscribe to continue as a witness, not as an accomplice. For man looks at what is outward, but the Lord looks at the heart. 1 Samuel 16:7.